They thought she was just another nobody walking into a place she could never afford, but by the end of that morning, they would wish they had never opened their mouths. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The revolving glass doors of the Grand Regent Hotel spun slowly under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, letting in a woman who didn't seem to belong in a place where rooms started at $1,200 a night and the marble floors reflected every polished shoe that crossed them. Emily Carter stepped inside quietly, her white blouse simple, her jeans neatly pressed but unmistakably modest, her sneakers clean but far from designer. She paused for just a second, taking in the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh lilies, her eyes steady, calm, almost as if she had seen it all before. Around her, businessmen in tailored suits checked their watches, a couple in evening wear laughed softly near the concierge desk, and a bellhop pushed a luggage cart stacked with expensive leather suitcases across the lobby. No one greeted her. No one offered help. It was as if she had walked in invisible. Emily approached the front desk with measured steps, her posture relaxed, her expression polite. Behind the counter, a young receptionist glanced up briefly, her eyes scanning Emily from head to toe in less than a second before returning to the screen, choosing instead to assist a well-dressed man who had arrived after her. Emily waited. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The quiet hum of the lobby filled the space between them, but something colder lingered beneath it, something unspoken but unmistakable. Finally, Emily leaned slightly forward, her voice soft but clear. "Excuse me, I just need to check something regarding a reservation." The receptionist didn't look up immediately. When she did, her smile was thin, practiced, and already fading. "Do you have a booking confirmation, ma'am?" she asked, emphasizing the last word just enough to create distance. Emily nodded gently. "I believe it's under Carter." The receptionist typed slowly, her expression shifting into mild skepticism. "I'm not seeing anything available under that name for walk-ins," she replied, her tone now less polite, more dismissive. Before Emily could respond, a pair of guests approached beside her, dressed in designer clothing, their presence immediately commanding attention. The receptionist straightened, her smile widening instantly as she turned away from Emily without a word. "Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Langford," she said warmly. Emily stepped back, allowing them space, her face calm, unreadable. But from across the lobby, a woman in a fitted navy blazer had been watching the entire exchange. Victoria Hayes, the hotel's floor manager, crossed her arms slightly as she observed Emily standing alone at the counter, her gaze narrowing with quiet judgment. She had seen this type before, or at least she thought she had. People who wandered into places they didn't belong, hoping to be treated like someone they weren't. Victoria adjusted her posture and began walking toward the desk, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, each step deliberate, each glance calculated. Emily remained still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her eyes steady, as if she already knew exactly what was about to happen next. And somewhere in the distance, just beyond the glass doors, a black luxury sedan pulled up to the entrance, unnoticed by almost everyone inside. The lobby continued its rhythm, unaware that in just a few moments, everything was about to change, and the silence that followed would say more than any apology ever could. Victoria Hayes stopped just a few feet from the front desk, her presence shifting the energy in the space before she even spoke. The receptionist straightened instantly, relief flickering across her face as if authority had arrived to confirm her silent assumptions. Victoria's eyes moved slowly over Emily, not hurried, not curious, but deliberate, measuring, dismissing. "Is there an issue here?" she asked, her tone calm but edged with control. The receptionist gave a small, almost apologetic shrug. "She says she has a reservation, but I cannot find anything under her name," she replied, lowering her voice slightly but not enough to keep nearby guests from hearing. Victoria nodded once, then turned her full attention to Emily, offering a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning," she said, her voice polished, professional, and unmistakably distant. "Perhaps there has been some confusion. Our property operates on confirmed bookings, especially at this level." Emily met her gaze without hesitation, her expression still composed. "I understand," she replied quietly. "I am not here for a room tonight. I just need to review a reservation under Carter. It should already be in your system." Victoria's smile tightened ever so slightly. She had heard that tone before, calm confidence from people who often had no real standing. "Ma'am," she said, tilting her head just enough to suggest patience wearing thin, "this is a 5-star property. We maintain a certain standard for our guests and their arrangements. If you do not have a confirmation number, I am afraid we cannot assist you further." A subtle murmur moved through the nearby guests, the kind that always followed moments that felt just slightly uncomfortable but too interesting to ignore. Emily noticed it, of course she did, but her posture did not change. "I am certain the reservation exists," she said, her voice still even. "Could you please check again?" Victoria let out a quiet breath, one that carried more annoyance than professionalism now. "We have already checked," she replied, her voice firmer. "And I would appreciate it if you did not hold up the line for our actual guests." The words landed harder than her tone suggested. A man standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, while another guest glanced over his shoulder with open curiosity. Emily lowered her eyes for just a moment, not in defeat, but in thought, as if deciding how much she was willing to say. "I am not trying to cause any trouble," she said gently. "I just need access to the account associated with this property." That was the moment Victoria's patience snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that carried quiet finality. She stepped slightly closer, lowering her voice, though it still carried enough to be heard. "This is not a public office," she said. "And it is certainly not a place for misunderstandings." Her eyes flicked briefly to Emily's clothes, then back to her face. "If you cannot provide proper credentials, I am going to have to ask you to leave." The word leave hung in the air longer than it should have, drawing attention from across the lobby now. Even the bellhop had slowed his pace, sensing something unfolding. Emily lifted her gaze again, meeting Victoria's eyes with the same steady calm. There was no anger there, no embarrassment, only a quiet certainty that made the moment feel strangely unbalanced. "You are asking me to leave," she repeated softly. Victoria straightened, her decision already made. "Yes," she said, her voice firm, final. "Please do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." And just outside, the black sedan's engine shut off, the driver stepping out as the rear door opened, unnoticed still, as the tension inside the lobby reached a point where silence felt louder than any confrontation. The air in the lobby did not move, as if even the chandeliers above had decided to hold their breath. Emily stood there, still and composed, while the word leave echoed quietly in the space between her and Victoria Hayes. For a brief second, it seemed like the entire room was waiting to see whether she would argue, whether she would defend herself, or whether she would simply walk away like so many others had done before her. But Emily did none of those things. Instead, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging something far deeper than the moment itself. "All right," she said softly. There was no anger in her voice, no trace of humiliation, only a calm acceptance that felt strangely out of place in a situation designed to provoke the opposite. Victoria blinked, just once, caught off guard by the lack of resistance. She had expected hesitation, maybe even pleading. What she received instead was silence. And something about that silence made her straighten her posture even more, as if doubling down on a decision she had already made. "Thank you for your cooperation," she replied, her tone returning to its polished form, though a faint edge remained. Emily turned slightly, her movements unhurried, her expression unchanged. As she took a step away from the counter, a few guests shifted to make space, their eyes following her with quiet curiosity. Some looked sympathetic, others indifferent, and a few seemed almost satisfied, as if the world had just confirmed what they already believed about who belonged and who did not. The marble floor echoed softly beneath her sneakers, a subtle contrast to the sharp clicks of heels and polished dress shoes around her. Behind her, the receptionist exhaled in relief, already turning back to her screen, eager to return to the rhythm of serving those she deemed more appropriate. Victoria, however, did not look away immediately. She watched Emily walk toward the entrance, her gaze narrowing slightly, a faint sense of unease settling in her chest that she could not quite explain. It was not doubt, not exactly, but something close to it, something that whispered that the situation might not be as simple as it appeared. She dismissed it quickly. Experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and her instincts had rarely been wrong in matters like this. Near the glass doors, the doorman stood ready, his posture formal, his expression neutral. He reached for the handle just as Emily approached, offering a polite nod as he opened the door. For a moment, sunlight spilled into the lobby, casting a soft glow across the marble floor, illuminating the contrast between the outside world and the carefully controlled luxury within. Emily paused at the threshold, just for a second, her hand brushing lightly against the door as if marking the moment. Her eyes moved once across the lobby behind her, not searching, not accusing, simply observing. And then she stepped forward. At that exact moment, the rear door of the black sedan outside opened fully, and a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit stepped out, his presence quiet but commanding, his movements precise, deliberate. The driver closed the door behind him, and for a brief second, the two paths intersected, though neither had yet acknowledged the other. Inside, Victoria turned away, already preparing to address the next guest, unaware that the decision she had just enforced was about to ripple through the entire building. And as the glass doors began to close, the faintest shift in the air followed, the kind that comes just before everything changes, the kind that leaves no room for taking back what has already been done. The glass doors had barely begun to close behind Emily when the man from the black sedan stepped forward, his polished shoes meeting the pavement with quiet precision, his gaze already fixed ahead as if he sensed something was not quite right. Daniel Carter did not rush, he never did, but there was a subtle urgency in the way he moved, the kind that did not need speed to command attention. As he approached the entrance, the doorman straightened instinctively, his posture sharpening as recognition flickered across his face. "Good morning, sir," the doorman said, his voice suddenly more attentive, more respectful. Daniel gave a brief nod, his expression composed, but his eyes shifted almost immediately past the man, catching sight of Emily just a few steps away. For a fraction of a second, something changed in his gaze, something deeper than surprise, something closer to concern. "Emily," he called, his voice calm but unmistakably directed. Emily paused mid-step, turning her head slightly, her eyes meeting his. There was no panic there, no distress, only that same quiet steadiness she had carried inside. "Daniel," she replied softly. He closed the distance between them in a few measured strides, his attention fully on her now, the rest of the world fading into the background. "What happened?" he asked, his tone low, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not need volume to be felt. Emily glanced briefly toward the lobby behind the glass doors, then back at him. "They could not find the reservation," she said simply. "And they asked me to leave." The words were delivered without accusation, without emotion, but they landed with a quiet finality that made something in Daniel's expression tighten ever so slightly. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked past her, through the glass, into the lobby where Victoria Hayes was already turning away, unaware of who stood just outside. The reflection of the chandeliers shimmered across the glass as Daniel's gaze sharpened, his posture shifting in a way that signaled a change not just in mood, but in consequence. Without another word, he turned and reached for the door, pushing it open with calm authority. The moment he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Conversation softened. Movements slowed. There was something about his presence that demanded attention, even from those who did not yet recognize him. The receptionist looked up first, her expression transitioning from routine politeness to sudden alertness. Victoria, mid-step, paused as if something had interrupted her rhythm, her eyes lifting toward the entrance. Daniel walked forward with measured confidence, each step echoing lightly across the marble floor, his gaze unwavering. He did not raise his voice. He did not call out. He simply stopped at the center of the lobby, his presence alone enough to draw every eye toward him. The room went silent. Victoria approached cautiously, her professional smile returning as she adjusted her blazer. "Good morning, sir," she began, her tone respectful, unaware of the ground shifting beneath her. "Welcome to the Grand Regent. How may we assist you today?" Daniel looked at her for a moment, not long, but long enough for the silence to deepen, for the weight of his attention to settle. Then, in a voice that was calm, precise, and impossible to ignore, he asked, "Who told my wife to leave?" The words did not echo, they did not need to. They simply existed in the air, clear and undeniable. Victoria's smile froze, her expression caught between confusion and realization, while behind her, the receptionist's hand stilled over the keyboard. A ripple moved through the lobby, subtle but undeniable, as the meaning of his words began to sink in. And in that moment, the certainty that had filled the room just minutes ago began to crack, replaced by something far more fragile, something that no one there could control anymore. No one spoke. Not immediately. The question lingered in the air, heavy and precise, as if the entire lobby had been placed under a spotlight that no one could escape. Victoria Hayes felt it first, the subtle shift from control to uncertainty, from authority to exposure. Her mind moved quickly, replaying the last few minutes, searching for a version of events that would protect her, that would explain this away. But there was no version that changed what had already been done. She forced a small breath, her posture still upright, though something in her composure had begun to fracture. "Sir, there must be some misunderstanding," she said carefully, her voice measured, but no longer as confident as before. Daniel did not respond. He simply watched her, his expression unchanged, his silence demanding more truth than any raised voice ever could. The receptionist glanced between them, her fingers hovering above the keyboard, unsure whether to move, to speak, or to disappear entirely. A guest near the concierge desk quietly stepped back, as if instinctively distancing himself from the unfolding moment. Victoria swallowed, the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her. "We follow strict policies regarding reservations and guest verification," she continued, her words now sounding rehearsed even to her own ears. "If your wife did not have the proper documentation, Daniel raised his hand slightly, not abruptly, but enough to stop her mid-sentence. The gesture was calm, almost effortless, but it carried absolute authority. She fell silent immediately. "I did not ask about your policies," he said, his voice even, controlled, and unmistakably firm. "I asked who told her to leave." The distinction was clear, and it left no room for deflection. Victoria's throat tightened. For the first time, she hesitated openly. Her gaze flicked briefly toward the receptionist, then back to Daniel, as if hoping someone else might take responsibility for what had happened. But the receptionist remained frozen, her earlier confidence gone, replaced by a quiet realization that she had been part of something much larger than she understood. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. Finally, Victoria spoke, though her voice had lost the sharp edge it once carried. "I did," she admitted, barely above a whisper. The words landed with a finality that echoed far louder than their volume. Daniel nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already known. There was no anger in his face, no raised voice, no dramatic reaction. And somehow, that made everything worse. "And why?" he asked. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it again, the answer suddenly far more complicated than it had seemed just minutes ago. She searched for something professional, something defensible. "She did not meet the expected profile of our guests," she said at last, the words feeling heavier as they left her lips. A faint murmur moved through the lobby, quieter this time, more uncertain. Daniel's gaze did not shift. Expected profile, he repeated, not as a question, but as a statement. He took a single step closer, the distance between them narrowing just enough to make the moment feel more intimate, more undeniable. "Do you know who she is?" he asked. Victoria hesitated again, the answer already forming in her mind, the realization beginning to settle in a way that made her chest tighten. "Your wife," she said, though the certainty in her voice was no longer complete. Daniel nodded once more. "She is also the reason this hotel exists," he said quietly. The words did not need emphasis. They carried their own weight, their own consequence. The receptionist's eyes widened, her breath catching softly as the meaning of his statement unfolded. Around them, the silence deepened, no longer curious, no longer entertained, but stunned. Victoria felt it then, fully, the collapse of everything she had assumed, everything she had acted on without question. Her posture faltered, just slightly, but enough to reveal what she could no longer hide. And in that moment, the certainty that had once defined her decisions was replaced by something far more fragile, something that could not be undone, no matter what she said next. The words settled over the lobby like a weight. No one could lift, and for the first time that morning, no one moved, no one spoke, not even the soft hum of conversation dared to return. Victoria Hayes felt the ground beneath her certainty give way completely, her mind struggling to reconcile the image she had judged with the reality now standing in front of her. Emily Carter, the quiet woman she had dismissed moments ago, stood just inside the doorway, her posture unchanged, her expression still calm, as if none of this surprised her. That was what unsettled Victoria the most, not the revelation, but the composure that came with it. Daniel Carter shifted his gaze briefly toward Emily, and in that small moment, the tension in his expression softened, not with weakness, but with respect, the kind that did not need to be displayed loudly. Then he looked back at Victoria, and whatever softness had appeared was gone. "This property was built on a simple principle," he said, his voice steady, carrying clearly across the silent room. "That every guest, regardless of how they look, should be treated with dignity." No one interrupted. No one even breathed too loudly. The receptionist lowered her eyes, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet realization that she had followed the tone set by someone she believed to be correct. A bellhop near the entrance stood frozen, his hands gripping the handle of the luggage cart as if it were the only thing anchoring him in place. Victoria tried to speak, her lips parting slightly, but no words came out at first. When she finally found her voice, it was no longer sharp or controlled, but uncertain, almost fragile. "Sir, I did not know," she said, the sentence incomplete even as it left her mouth. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He simply held her gaze. "You are right," he replied. "You did not know." The agreement caught her off guard, but it did not bring relief. It made the situation worse. "But you decided anyway," he continued, his tone unchanged, each word measured. "You decided who belonged here and who did not, based on nothing but appearance." The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable. Victoria's shoulders lowered slightly, the confidence that had once defined her now completely gone. She glanced briefly toward Emily, as if hoping for some acknowledgement, some sign that this could be undone, but Emily remained still, her eyes steady, offering neither accusation nor comfort. That silence spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. Daniel turned slightly, addressing not just Victoria, but the entire room. "This hotel does not exist because of marble floors or 5-star ratings," he said. "It exists because of trust. Because people believe they will be treated with respect the moment they walk through those doors." A faint shift moved through the guests, some nodding subtly, others lowering their gaze, recognizing themselves in the moment more than they expected. "When that trust is broken," Daniel continued, "it does not matter how polished everything looks. It is already damaged." Victoria felt the words land deeper than any direct accusation. They were not loud, not dramatic, but they left no room for defense. She straightened slightly, not out of confidence, but out of instinct, as if trying to hold on to what little remained of her composure. "I understand," she said quietly, though her voice carried the weight of someone who knew understanding had come too late. Daniel studied her for a brief moment, then gave a small nod, not of approval, but of conclusion. The decision had already been made long before she realized it. And in the silence that followed, the lesson was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone in that room. Victoria Hayes stood there as if the ground beneath her had shifted permanently, her carefully constructed authority dissolving into something unrecognizable. The silence around her was no longer just tension, it was judgment, quiet and collective. Daniel Carter did not rush the moment. He allowed it to settle, to fully take hold, because some lessons needed to be felt, not just heard. His gaze moved briefly across the lobby, taking in every face, every employee who had witnessed the exchange and chosen, in one way or another, to remain silent. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a finality that could not be mistaken. "Effective immediately," he said, his words precise, deliberate, "you are no longer employed by this property." There was no raised voice, no dramatic pause, but the impact was immediate. Victoria's breath caught softly, her posture stiffening as the meaning of his words settled in. For a moment, it seemed as though she might respond, might attempt to explain, to negotiate, to recover something from what had just been taken. But nothing came. Because there was nothing left to defend. The receptionist inhaled sharply behind the desk, her eyes widening as she realized the decision extended beyond just one person. Daniel's gaze shifted toward her next, not harsh, but unyielding. "That includes anyone who participated in or supported this decision," he added, his tone unchanged. The words spread through the staff like a ripple, subtle but devastating. The bellhop near the entrance lowered his eyes. Another employee behind the concierge desk stepped back slightly, as if distance might shield them from the consequence. No one spoke. No one argued. Because they all understood. This was not about a mistake. It was about a mindset. Victoria's shoulders dropped, the last trace of her earlier confidence gone. She nodded faintly, more to herself than to him, as if accepting a reality she could no longer avoid. "I understand," she said quietly, though her voice carried the weight of someone who had only just realized the cost of her assumptions. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, his attention returning to Emily. The shift was subtle, but it changed the entire tone of the moment. Where his presence had been firm and authoritative, it now softened, grounded in something far more personal. Emily stepped forward slowly, her movements calm, unhurried, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. She stopped beside him, her eyes briefly meeting his before turning toward Victoria. There was no anger there, no desire to prolong the moment, only a quiet clarity. "It was never about the reservation," she said gently. Her voice was soft, but in the silence, it carried across the entire lobby. "It was about how you chose to treat someone you believed had nothing to offer you." Victoria closed her eyes for just a second, the truth of it landing deeper than anything else that had been said. When she opened them again, the lobby looked different, not because anything had changed physically, but because she now saw it without the certainty that had once guided her. Around them, the guests remained still, watching, absorbing, reflecting. The marble floors still gleamed. The chandeliers still shone. But something invisible had shifted, something far more important than appearances. Daniel placed a hand lightly at Emily's back, not as a gesture of control, but of acknowledgement, of respect. Together, they stood at the center of the space, not elevated, not distant, but grounded in a presence that no longer needed explanation. And in that moment, the lesson was complete, not through anger or force, but through a quiet, undeniable truth that lingered long after the words had been spoken. No one moved to fill the silence after the decision had been made, as if the entire lobby understood that what had just happened could not be softened or undone with polite conversation or routine gestures. Victoria Hayes stepped back slowly, her heels no longer echoing with authority but with something far quieter, something closer to realization. The receptionist remained behind the desk, her hands resting lightly on the counter now, no longer pretending to be busy, no longer hiding behind a screen. For the first time that morning, she looked directly at Emily, not with dismissal, but with something uncertain, almost reflective. Around them, the guests who had once watched with casual curiosity now stood differently, their posture more reserved, their expressions thoughtful, as if each of them had been placed into the story without warning. Daniel Carter allowed the moment to settle before he spoke again, not to prolong discomfort, but to give it meaning. "This place will continue," he said calmly, his voice steady, "but not like this." His words were not directed at any one person, but at everyone who had witnessed what had unfolded. Every person who walks through these doors should feel welcome, not evaluated. The statement did not sound like a correction. It sounded like a reset. The kind that could not be ignored. A senior staff member from the back office stepped forward cautiously, his tie slightly loosened, his expression careful but attentive. He had clearly recognized Daniel long before anyone else had, but had chosen to wait, to observe, to understand. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we will ensure the standard is corrected immediately." Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging the response without turning the moment into a performance. Emily, still beside him, glanced once more across the lobby, her eyes moving over the same marble floors, the same polished surfaces, but now seeing something different beneath them. Not luxury. Not status. But the choices people made when they believed no one important was watching. She turned slightly toward the front desk, her voice calm, steady, and unmistakably clear. "Kindness is not part of a dress code," she said. The sentence was simple, but it carried further than anything else spoken that morning. The receptionist lowered her gaze, not out of shame alone, but out of understanding, the kind that arrives too late to change the past but just in time to change what comes next. The bellhop near the entrance adjusted his grip on the cart, his posture shifting as if silently committing to something different. Even the guests, those who had stood at a distance, seemed to absorb the moment in their own quiet way, some exchanging glances, others simply standing still, as if replaying their own assumptions in their minds. Daniel placed his hand gently against the counter, not as a gesture of control, but as a signal that the moment had reached its end. "We are done here," he said softly. There was no anger in his voice, no need for it. The message had already been delivered. He turned toward Emily, offering a small nod, and together they moved toward the center of the lobby, not rushed, not dramatic, but steady. As they walked, the space seemed to shift around them, not because anything physical had changed, but because everyone watching now saw them differently, not as a contrast, but as a reminder. The doors remained open behind them, sunlight still pouring in, and for a brief moment, the line between inside and outside no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like a choice. And in that quiet, unmistakable shift, the lesson settled deeper than any policy ever could, leaving behind something that would remain long after the morning had passed. The lobby did not return to normal right away, because something deeper than routine had been interrupted, something that could not simply be reset with a smile or a polished greeting. As Daniel and Emily moved toward the entrance, their steps steady and unhurried, the silence followed them like a quiet witness, lingering in every corner of the room. The chandeliers still shimmered above, the marble floors still reflected every detail, but the atmosphere had changed in a way no one could ignore. Behind them, Victoria Hayes remained where she stood, no longer a figure of authority, but a person confronted with the weight of her own decisions. She watched them go, her expression no longer guarded, no longer confident, but thoughtful, almost searching. Not for excuses, not for a way out, but for understanding. The receptionist slowly straightened her posture, her hands resting on the desk as she looked toward the entrance, her earlier assumptions now replaced by something quieter, something more aware. The guests, too, began to shift, some returning to their conversations, but with a noticeable difference in tone, softer, more measured, as if each word now carried a little more awareness than before. Outside, the sunlight stretched across the pavement, warm and steady, as Emily paused just beyond the doors. She turned slightly, her gaze moving back through the glass, not to revisit what had happened, but to acknowledge it, to recognize the moment for what it had been. Daniel stood beside her, his presence calm, grounded, his attention not on the building, but on her. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Emily gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, but her eyes thoughtful. "I am," she said. "It was never about me." He studied her for a brief moment, understanding more than her words alone could explain. Together, they stepped forward, leaving the entrance behind them, the doors closing gently. As the boundary between the inside and outside settled once again. Inside, the senior staff member who had stepped forward earlier began to move with quiet purpose, addressing the remaining employees with a tone that carried both urgency and clarity. There were no raised voices, no dramatic commands, only a shift in expectation, a reminder that what had been tolerated before would no longer be ignored. The receptionist took a breath, then adjusted her stance, her movements more deliberate now, as the next guest approached the desk. This time, her greeting came quicker, warmer, not forced, but chosen. The bellhop straightened as well, his posture reflecting not just duty, but intention. Even Victoria, after a long moment, turned slowly and walked toward the back office, not to escape, but to begin facing what came next, whatever that might be. And as the lobby gradually found its rhythm again, it was no longer the same rhythm it had before. It was quieter, more aware, shaped not by policy alone, but by something less visible and far more lasting. Outside, Emily and Daniel reached the waiting car, the driver opening the door with a respectful nod. Before stepping in, Emily glanced once more at the building, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding of what had just unfolded. She did not need to say anything more. The lesson had already been delivered, not through force, not through anger, but through a moment that revealed exactly how easily dignity can be taken, and how powerfully it can be restored. And that morning, in a place built on appearances, something far more important had been remembered, that respect is not earned by status, and it is not measured by wealth, it is given freely, or not at all, and the difference between those two choices is what defines everything that follows.